Hello, I'm Juliana Smith. I'm a volunteer with WORLDwrite, and we're here today interviewing people about the EU and the Lisbon Treaty. So could you just tell us briefly, are you in favour of the EU or not?
Yes, I am. I'm in favour of it.
Okay, are there any reasons behind that?
I just think that we should cooperate more. That's it. So with having the EU, we can then cooperate with the rest of Europe.
The history of Europe is quite a painful history, so obviously more integration, more cooperation is always a good thing, economically and socially.
Right. So you think it benefits Europe?
Yeah, it benefits Europe, especially east of Europe is really coming up because of it economically. Also the west as well, Britain, I think we get lots of different migrant groups coming in, and that's good for a city like London. You have lots of different people, always healthy. Yeah.
Being less kind of like national-centric in the UK and kind of being free across borders and stuff, I think is a really good thing. I think there's a lot of the issues about it have become just very bogged down in a kind of UK independence like rhetoric, which has really detracted from a proper debate about the issues, and I think that's sad.
I think the reason most people have a problem with it is because they think it's trying to exceed what it actually has set out to do, which is basically enhance trade between the European countries, and that strikes me as a sensible thing to do, especially when you've got powers like America and now China threatening to become world dominant in trade.
So given that, do you think it's appropriate for the Irish to hold a referendum and when they voted no, be asked to hold yet another and vote again?
I mean, it strikes me that the first referendum should have been binding, given that it had been agreed that they would have a referendum. I'd like to know a bit more about what reasons are being given for taking it again. I assume there must be some. I suppose it adds to people's generally held beliefs that the powers that be in the centralised part of the European Union are a law unto themselves.
But yeah, it does sort of sound like, they didn't get the answer they wanted, and so vote again.
What happens when countries don't want certain bits of the European project? Maybe there's certain things here that we don't want in there. But we have to find a way to, I think, allow countries to do things at different speeds in Europe.
Well, obviously democracy is a brilliant thing, and it's always needs to be there. People always need the option to vote, but at the same time, sometimes with the EU, some issues are very abstract, and maybe the ordinary person doesn't fully understand them or isn't fully informed. So at the moment anyway, it seems as if people are voting for something they don't understand.
Would you have liked to have had a vote in it?
Yes, I think I would have. Although I say that instantly, but then I think, well, maybe it would have been voted against in Britain. So I would have sacrificed my vote and, the democratic right of the British people to get it through. So in a way, democracy is like defunct. Yeah. Okay. I don't know. I'm very pro-Europe, so if voting means that it's going to restrict the further integration, then maybe we shouldn't. I don't know. Yeah.
I think the worst thing about the EU is that no one knows about it. I watch Question Time when I want to find out about stuff, because they're meant to know everything, and then on Question Time I was watching it and the audience were asking questions and they didn't have answers that made me understand, and so for that reason I can't be for it, but I'm not against it either because I don't know about it. Politicians and the people who are pro-Europe need to actually come out and make their case and win us over in a democratic way.
Should there be a referendum on being part of the European Union?
Definitely. There definitely should. There should be lots and lots of information, and this isn't just by people who are for it. I want everyone who has any opinion on the EU to tell me their opinion. And so once I have all the information, I can then collect it and I can make my own informed opinion, because and then after that, then I want a referendum, because England we need to make a choice. We need to solve the Europe question.
What I know is as a British citizen, I should be able to vote, but I can't. Ireland can vote, but English people can't vote, Scottish people can't vote, Germans can't vote, French can't vote. I don't see the reason why.
Do you think Ireland should have been asked to vote again? Absolutely not. I think that particularly when you look at the context of the Lisbon Treaty, where it was originally the EU constitution, which was rejected in democratic vote in the Netherlands and France, and then turned into the Lisbon Treaty as a way of trying to bypass the votes in every country apart from Ireland, the fact that they are asking them to vote again, I think is a clear sign they're not interested in the democratic will of any of the peoples of Europe, be they Irish, Dutch or French.
I think each person should be able to contribute, like they have the ability to vote, despite the fact that the government is there to sort of make the major impact, so to speak. But I think the people still have to hear their voices and, make their own opinions known.
Thank you very much. This has been Marie Straker reporting for WORLDwrite's News on the Streets of Hackney.
So, hello and welcome to this WorldwRite special. And I'm delighted to have been invited to chair this in conversation on the European Union and the forthcoming referendum in Ireland on the Lisbon Treaty, which will take place on Friday the 2nd of October. My name's Tara McCormack. I'm lecturer in international politics at the University of Leicester, and I'm very pleased to introduce Chris Bickerton, who's lecturer in international politics at the University of Oxford. So, Chris, do you want to start by giving us your thoughts on the European Union and more specifically the Lisbon Treaty and the referendum?
Okay, thanks Tara. On the 2nd of October, all eyes in Europe are going to be on Ireland. The Irish people are voting for the second time on the Lisbon Treaty, and a lot of European politicians are hoping that they're going to vote yes. Now, the first time when Ireland voted on the Lisbon Treaty, it was last year in June, and a majority of Irish people voted against the treaty. Now, this threw the European politicians up in arms. There was a big hoo-ha about what to do, and some were saying that there is no plan B. The Irish have voted no, there's not a lot that we can do. But there was a plan B, which was to get the Irish to vote again. The big change, and this is one that the Yes campaign, the Irish politicians, the one who negotiated this change, have been making a big deal of, which is that Ireland has certain, if you like, promises made to it on the part of the European Union about what issues of concern that really came up in the previous campaign are not going to be on the table for the European Union. They're not going to be problems for Ireland with the Lisbon Treaty. And these were issues which were very controversial in Ireland. It was issues like Ireland's role in military engagements by the European Union, sending military missions to other parts of the world for peacekeeping and those kinds of things. A lot of Irish people are concerned about the neutrality of Ireland. There was the question of abortion. There was a fear that the European Union would begin to legislate on abortion and would challenge very strong anti-abortion groups and laws in Ireland. There was also the question of a commissioner for Ireland. The Irish were concerned that they would no longer have their own commissioner, that is to say, an Irish politician, an Irish person sitting on the European Commission with a portfolio as a commissioner. So these were all the issues that came up in the campaign, and what the Irish government was able to negotiate was a promise on the part of the European Union to not have the European Union legislating on these issues. And that promise didn't take the form of a new treaty or a new kind of negotiation between governments, because if it was to somehow fundamentally transform the treaty, then all the other governments would have to go back to their countries and vote again or pass this treaty through their national parliaments again. And because the consensus on the Lisbon Treaty was such a finely managed affair, to suddenly change it and ask people to think again, vote again, there was the fear that the whole thing would unravel. So that was the deal, if you like, that the Irish government negotiated in Brussels. But the cost, what the Irish government had to then go and do, was to have this second referendum. Now, it's not an easy thing to do, to go back and to say to your population, well, thanks, but you're going to have to do it again, and we'd like to have a different result this time. But that's been what they've asked. Now, there are some interesting things that have come up. One is the role of business. Obviously, the economic crisis, the global financial crisis, happened between the first vote and this vote. And the Irish economy has suffered greatly. It's one of the countries that's suffered most in this global economic crisis. And that's influenced the campaign in lots of different ways. The big issue has been whether or not the Lisbon Treaty is good or bad for the Irish economy. And some have been saying, well, it's going to create jobs. Others have been saying it's going to take jobs away. And you had some big global multinational companies that have invested in Ireland in the past and continue to have activities in Ireland, who've come out very strongly in favour of the Yes campaign. There's been a strong attempt to mobilise young people in favour of the Lisbon Treaty, because the young people were, if you like, the demographic group that were most hostile, it seemed, to the treaty, whether because they didn't vote and weren't interested or because they actively went out and voted no. Now this time round you've had groups called Generation Yes, for example, that are heavily mobilising young people and are themselves young people wanting to argue in favour of the treaty. And you have groups called We Belong, there's another group called Ireland for Europe. There's all these Yes groups that have come up. So the Yes side seems to be pretty strong. Some have been saying we must talk about the treaty. The reason it didn't work last time was that people were talking about the government and how they didn't like the government. People were talking about lots of things, but they weren't talking about what was in the Lisbon Treaty. So some groups have been saying this is what we must focus on. Then others have been saying, well, actually, there are bigger issues at stake. This is an existential question for Ireland. This is about what it means to be Irish. This is about Ireland's role in Europe. If we vote no, we are excluding ourselves from all these different opportunities to influence our future. We're saying very clearly that we are anti-European, and for the Irish people, this is going to be an experience of isolation and marginalisation. And that seems to be the two different sides to the way the campaign's been going. I think on the Yes side, there's a tendency to exaggerate the importance of the text, and to suggest that if it's written in the treaty, then such and such will happen. Now, it's extremely difficult to predict the future based on treaties. The specific articles in the treaty being quite vague, and it's very difficult to predict actually the outcome. If you hear the Yes side, they say this is a chance for Europe to become more dynamic, more effective, more powerful in world affairs. This is a chance for Europe to play its full role alongside the United States and to really start to influence world trends. Now, if you read the text of the treaty, it's absolutely impossible to tell what the outcome is going to be. Having something written down on paper and actually how it plays out in practice is very difficult. And especially in the European Union, where there's so much bargaining and negotiations between people, that what's decided at one time changes very much a couple of years down the line, and certainly 10 years down the line. And so the treaty itself cannot tell us very much. The answers don't lie in the treaty. And I don't know if any of you have actually tried to read the treaty, but it is not something that you can read. It is not a book. So it's something that you can look at and you can see what the intentions are, but you can't derive a huge amount from it.
It strikes me as very strange that the fact that Ireland has now twice been told to vote again and do it right this time, just doesn't seem to be much of a political issue in itself. There doesn't seem to be that much of a broader reflection on the EU. Almost. And does this maybe tell us something about the level of perhaps discontent in Ireland?
It's actually quite an interesting parallel on both sides of the debate. On the side of the no campaign, there's a very powerful poster which was up, which I saw in photos of, which said, and it had a picture of the Irish Prime Minister, and it said, Lisbon is only going to say one job, and it's going to be his. And I thought that was pretty compelling. That was pretty powerful. It's probably quite right, actually. So that was on the one on that side. You had this strong sense of disenchantment, disaffection, disgust at the Irish political class and the actual government in place now. So very strong sentiment on the no side, and a lot of people are worried that the Irish are going to vote more about what they think about their government than about the treaty itself. But then on the other hand, on the yes side, you have a very similar feeling of political disenchantment. Because a lot of people are saying we should vote for this treaty because we cannot trust our politicians an inch to govern us in any way that makes sense. They've been called thieves, and these thieving politicians, we shouldn't trust them at all. So we should prefer to be ruled by officials in Brussels than by our own politicians in Dublin, because they are corrupt and not to be trusted. And that's quite a strong, that sense of scepticism about their own national representatives is ironically shared both on the no side and the yes side, but you can just draw very different conclusions. And I think ultimately on the no side, that sense of disenchantment and cynicism is a bit more positive, because you're not wanting to then give power to somebody else. You're wanting to keep it for yourself, but you'd rather have somebody else in there, or you'd rather be able to change your own government and have a better government in there. So I think that's the more positive sentiment, because the other one is saying let's give up the possibility that we govern ourselves altogether and let's try and get Brussels to do things for us, which is just a case of giving up your own political liberties and political freedoms.
There were some very harsh comments made against the Irish when they rejected the vote the first time. How does the EU see the Irish voters?
Now, when the Irish voted no, that wasn't seen as the end of the. People didn't think, well, that's it. We've just got to give this treaty up. They thought, oh, well, okay, let's go back to let's discuss, let's work out what we can do, let's see how we can get around it. So the idea that the Irish people have to vote again a second time is entirely in keeping with the way the European Union works. Because if you're a minister, of agriculture or of finance or something, you regularly go to meetings and you say, this is my national position, this is what Ireland believes, this is what Britain believes, this is what France believes. Then around the table people say what they believe. And you then have to change a little bit your position because you realise that you're not quite in keeping with everybody else. And there's just this gradual process of accommodation with other positions around the table. And eventually you get agreement. And that is the essence, if you like, of the European Union. It's this process of generating consensus and compromise. And so the idea that the Irish would vote again is simply part of this wider sense of what the European Union is all about. And to be honest, many people don't see anything wrong with that. It's seen as an entirely laudable, in fact, an even wonderful thing to do, is to achieve consensus and compromise.
I think we can see that as well in the kind of domestic sphere, where very much there's a move away from kind of, the politics of contestation. We've had ideas that governments of all the talents, whereas it's seen, whereas traditionally we would have understood democratic politics, contestation over two positions and the winner takes it. So just maybe finally a broader question, and then we'll go out to the studio audience, because I'm sure I have lots of things to ask. I know that in WORLDwrite campaigns for open borders, I know that you and both are, we're sort of sympathetic to the idea that one day national borders, should be overcome, and that there is a sort of better way for people to exist. But yet, so on the one hand, can't we see the EU as this extremely positive cosmopolitan project, which has to some extent eroded borders, at least within the EU, and yet you seem to be quite critical of it? Why?
I mean, I think I would just say it's possible to be very pro-European, but also very critical of the European Union. And I think it is a problem that the European Union has taken for itself this label of Europe and claims to speak in the name of Europe. When what it really does is it is the European Union. It's not something else, and it's not Europe in general. It is the European Union as it's developed and as it is. And in that sense, I think it's not really a cosmopolitan ideal. I mean, it's essentially it's a forum within which national governments are able to negotiate amongst themselves and achieve certain outcomes that if they were forced to go and debate with their own publics, they would probably not get very far. So one of the interesting cases in terms of immigration is that the European Union is often used as a place where governments can take very, very hard line on questions of political asylum, for example. That they know that if they were to have this as a bigger public debate, it would not necessarily go in the way that they wanted. So it's a way of managing issues without really having public arguments and public debates. And if you think of the ideal of Europe as being a place where politics has emerged and the modern state has formed, and it's been a place of political contestation, then the European Union is very much is very un-European in that respect.
Okay, so now I'll go out to the studio audience, so I now have lots of questions.
One of the things I noticed earlier while I was going out into the streets of Wood Green and interviewing people about European politics was a lot of people would say when you asked them about the European Union, oh, I don't know enough about that to answer your questions, which is obviously quite an unusual thing. Most people don't feel that well informed on questions about, for example, the environment, the economy and so on, but they're happy to have an opinion on it. Why do you think the European politicians aren't able to inspire people about the project?
Ireland voted the first time and they say no. And they ask them to vote again. And instead of asking them to vote again, it's the same thing. Have anyone actually tried to question, why did you say no? Is there anything we can do to clarify it?
They say that they did take into account the concerns of their voters. And so what is being presented to them is not identical. Now that, I think, is asking a lot from the Irish people, to believe almost on faith that European leaders will do what they promise to do in a few years' time. Now, for an Irish citizen who's already been asked to vote for a second time, feels as if the European Union is making a mockery of their own democratic processes, it's a lot to take on board and say, I'm going to trust you. Because one of the dominant themes coming out of the first no vote was, you're asking us to trust you, but we're not willing to trust you. You're saying that treaty is really complicated, that we don't have to read it, but we should trust you that there's lots of good things in there. Well, we're not going to take you at your word. And so the changes that have been proposed are still in the model of, well, trust us and you'll see it'll all be fine, rather than anything which substantially changed the Lisbon Treaty. So I think it's a legitimate concern to say, look, we're being asked to vote on the same text, nothing's really gone on here, nothing's really changed. On the question of how can you really have a debate on something if you don't know what the implications of the treaty will be, I mean, I think that's a good question, and it does make the debate very difficult. And it certainly puts the pressure on those people who are pretending to say, look at Article sort of 54, there's your answer. Because I don't think you should ever believe anybody who says that, because I don't think you can really, that's just simply not true. So the most that you can have a debate about the general orientation or certain aspects of the treaty. You can have a general debate about the Lisbon Treaty. But I think if you're unwilling to have a broader discussion about what this means beyond just the text, then you're avoiding the real debate.
Do you think that businesses like Ryanair should be allowed to persuade the voters into what they decide to vote?
Would it be possible to rewrite the Lisbon Treaty so that everybody is able to understand this Lisbon Treaty? And would it be possible to put the stress on education? Because this is, I think, the real key in order to make changes and to allow the public to be aware of what is happening.
I was just wondering who actually benefits from this ambiguity of the treaty exactly, and why are these member countries agreeing to ratify the treaty if it is so vague and there aren't any concrete elements to it that they don't know what is it actually going to entail, what is the purpose of it, what are they actually agreeing to in principle?
Ryanair, I think whoever should have the right to get involved in the debate and say whatever they like. So the fact that the Ryanair CEO is piling in there and making a big fuss and inviting people, to travel freely on his planes to come and promote the Yes campaign in Ireland, I don't have a problem with that as such. What I guess is revealing are the double standards. The Ryanair CEO does this. If the No campaign had done something similar, they would have been accused of all sorts of dirty tricks. So why is it legitimate for this person to push forward what is obviously a private interest, but in such a public way, whereas in any other instance, on the No side, if they'd have done something like that, they'd have been disparaged and criticised for it. So I think at the end of the day, anybody should be allowed to come in and make, you mustn't treat people as fools who can't listen to somebody and have a critical view. So if you've got Michael O'Leary standing up and giving you his spiel about why he thinks the Lisbon Treaty is fantastic, I think you've probably got a good proportion of Irish people who can take that with a pinch of salt and say, oh, there's Mick sort of going on about the Lisbon Treaty. Well, we all know why he's doing that. Let's listen to what he's got to say, but let's also take that with a pinch of salt. And I think that's the way people tend to listen to anybody who has something to say like that. So yeah, he should be absolutely allowed to speak his mind, and so should everybody else. What's interesting, and this goes to the question about ambiguity, and also I guess the question about education. There is something that's fundamentally the wrong way round about the way the campaign's been run and the way the whole referenda discussion in Europe takes place. The idea is that instead of informing publics to then make their own decision, whether it be on one side or the other, whether it be yes or no, the idea is that you try and convince them to just go down in one direction. So it's not a case of European politicians deciding to have these votes and then being happy that whichever way it goes, you've decided to vote. That's the nature of majoritarian politics. The majority decides and will respect your opinion. It simply doesn't work that way. In Ireland, the first time they voted last year, a majority said no. And instead of the government saying, we're going to take that on board, that's what the majority decided, we're going to represent that view in Brussels and defend that view, they came back to Brussels and in a rather embarrassed way said, look, we've got this problem. They just don't seem to get it in our country. What can we do? And so they had to find a way around it. So the idea of educating for an outcome which is open, it doesn't really, the outcome has been decided. The agreement has been made, and the national governments are told to go off and make sure it works and that they don't have any problems. And so who benefits from the ambiguity of the treaty? Well, the treaty essentially is quite revolutionary in some ways because it introduces a big gap between states and peoples. So the governments have freedom to do lots of things, and the treaty is very ambiguous, so it allows them to interpret things and, in the way that they want. But you have this new gap between those governments deciding these things and then the people who have very little role at all in the process. And I think that's where the ambiguity comes in, and that's how they benefit.
If the European Union, lots of the politicians there had to debate with their own publics, they wouldn't get very far. I was wondering, how can the EU, because you said you're pro-Europe but not pro-EU, how can the EU develop systems and institutions that can improve your view of them? And we're all here sitting talking about Ireland. Should we not be very angry that we can't have a referendum ourselves over this issue because it affects us just as much as it affects them?
I wanted to ask Chris if you could give us an indication of how powerful the EU is.
You mentioned earlier, Chris, that the no side had disappeared this time around. I was wondering what the reasons were. Have they just given up, or are they now happy with the compromises that have been given?
I just wondered if you, what your thoughts were on the fact that Ireland saying no to the treaty maybe kind of exposed the EU establishment's kind of lack of democracy, really, kind of democratic masquerade falling away. And behind the facade really is kind of an EU elitism and really autocratic kind of establishment, whereby they're so surprised that Ireland have said no because they've given them so much money and they expect them to fall into line. And really, does that question the whole accountability and fairness of the EU as a political establishment? Because there's issues over sovereign equality really there, because poorer countries which need the EU's money, are they expected to toe the line regardless of what they think, feel, or how that affects their sovereignty and their citizens?
The European Union isn't something that European states today and European populations can somehow leave. You can't really exit the EU. The EU is just the way we understand politics today. So we elect a government, those are our national representatives. The way they understand their power is not just that they won an election. They understand their power partly by the relations that they have, quite personal relations with other European leaders. Our civil servants understand their power as much as being about what their ministers tell them to do, as it is about the relations they have with lots of other national officials in the working groups that they participate in Brussels. So it's the sea in which we swim is European Union politics. Now, that makes it really important for us to understand what that actually means. And the treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, is an occasion for us to reflect on that, because the treaty is a nice metaphor, if you like, of what European Union politics is all about. Now, if it's the sea in which we swim, the question is it what's the sea like? Is it freezing cold and we want to get out? Or is it nice and warm in a place that we want to stay? And I think the Lisbon Treaty puts a really good question on the table for us. And this is the question that the Irish have had to confront and that the Irish government have tried to avoid, which is that there's a pretty stark choice between different understandings of politics. So on the one hand, you can say, okay, we will give our power to make decisions and influence our lives up to our own governments, let them negotiate that amongst themselves. Things will come from those negotiations down to us. Our national courts will implement them. You're essentially opting for, if you like, a view of politics which is about efficiency, about getting things done. It's not really about either debating. It's not really about whether there are different sides to a particular question. It's not really about preferences. It's just about getting things done. It's in some sense it's not really politics. It's just pure administration, bureaucracy. Now, That's essentially what the European Union embodies. It doesn't do democracy. You know, the European Union is not democratic. To make it democratic would be to abolish it and create something else. So the situation we're in at the moment is a peculiar situation because over the last 15 years or so, governments have struggled to do the things that they were happy doing without any interference from their own populations. There weren't any problems about the legitimacy of the European Union or the democratic credentials of the European Union. These are recent debates. So now we've got this confrontation of two different kinds of visions. And those wanting to defend democracy have a choice, which is, do you try and make the European Union more democratic? And that's what some people try and do. Or do you think, well, there's nothing that we can do with this institution, we just have to get rid of it and create something better? And I think the history of the referenda, whether it's in France, whether it's in Holland, whether it's in Ireland now, shows that there is a very firm, institutionalized way of doing business in the European Union, which is the one that I described. It's about getting around the table, it's about not having debates about political principle, it's not having big confrontations, it's about getting some kind of agreement. Now, you can't change that. You can't, add a little bit to the European Union, which is about, people's petitions, or a bit more power to national parliaments to influence what the European Union does, which is all what's in the Lisbon Treaty. So these are the concrete examples of the little reforms that people have tried to do. Now, if you scratch the surface, these things don't really improve things at all. The People's Petition was an idea that was introduced. Basically, the People's Petition, it allows, if you get enough signatures within Europe, for the Commission to rethink a particular proposal that's made. That's the People's Petition idea. Now, the history of that came from the German government saying, look, if we don't have something that looks a bit like popular democracy, we're not going to be able to sell this without having a referendum. And if we have a referendum, we're not going to win it. So we need something to give to our people. And so they came up with this idea of a people's petition. So that was a way of getting around a referendum in Germany. So I think these are the if you like, the secret histories behind these reform proposals within the Lisbon Treaty. So I mean, my personal opinion is the European Union embodies this way of doing politics that, for me, is nothing to do with politics at all. Politics is about saying, this is what I believe, and if we're going to have to agree to disagree, then we're going to have to go with what the majority decides. You can't get around the fact that people see things, in profoundly different ways, and you can't trade in a way that makes everybody happy. You have to make hard choices. Now, if you don't want that kind of politics, then what you're wanting is the European Union. So the Lisbon Treaty and the debate in Ireland is relevant for all of us because it poses the question of what kind of politics do we want. And that's why I think it's really relevant. And the individual parts of the treaty can have important aspects on our lives in a very concrete way. But the more exciting questions that it poses, the ones that really should excite our imagination, are the ones about the kind of society in which we want to live, the way we want to organise our life collectively together.
I'm afraid to say that's all we've got time for, so thanks very much for your questions, and if we can just thank Chris Bickerton.